Hello and welcome to another CS200 mini lecture. Today we'll talk about chapter 1711, and in that chapter we'll talk about reading files from a GUI. The nice thing about this type of interface is it allows you to select files without having to type the information in, much like you do with a standard Windows file selector or an iOS file selector with an Apple product. Let's get started. Now Java provides something called a JFileChooser, which is a Swing GUI component that allows us to navigate directories and file selection. And we'll have an example here in a minute, and it'll look very familiar to you. Again, let's take a look at this component, and you can see what this will do is provide something that looks similar to this. So let's get started in BlueJ and take a look at it there. So you can see the imports that we need to do, many of these from the toolbox for graphics. And also we can see some I/O because we'll be working with files. We have Java Util Scanner because we'll be creating a scanner object. And then we have a bunch of Swing components. The one we're interested in is this one here, which is the JFileChooser. Of course, we'll need to create something to extend JFrame and also implement Action Listener. So we declare a bunch of variables. The one that we are most interested in is, of course, the JScrollPlane, which allows us to add a scroll bar to go up and down the items when we select them. We also want to be able to hold the name of the file and the other labels that we need to have show up. And then we have a button that allows us to select whichever file we have, as well as a file chooser, which allows us to select the file. We have a grid bag layout, and in that layout we select the file, but we have to be able to read it. So what we do here is we read it a little bit differently than we would if we just read a file that a user typed. So again, the button is what triggers the action. So we have this action performed, and we've defined it as just a single event. And we've got one. So we have a file input stream, which we set to null initially. And then we have a scanner object. We have a read line, which allows us to input the values from the file because we'll actually be reading the file, not just getting the file name. And then we'll have a file chooser, which allows us to choose a specific file. Notice it's an integer. So we set the file chooser dialog to allow us to open that particular file. And then if we have approved it, in which we selected the file in the list, we'll be able to go and update the file field. So by selecting a particular file, we're able to actually see it run. I'm going to run this, and up pops a dialog box like we see here. So if I click Open File, that's going to read it from whichever directory is set to the current directory. So you can see here, I can bring this up, and I just go to a particular RTF. So I can select different directories, and this allows me to make a selection of a file. Once I've selected it, when I click on it, that triggers it to appear in this file name box. We go back to the code. This is where we actually select the file, and it updates the file field, which is this here. So we need to determine if we can read the file. So we need to clear out the text box, and if we can read it, that's great. Otherwise, we need to throw an exception and provide a message to the user. So I'm going to go ahead and open this one, and you can see it just provides a bunch of numbers, and it's got the slider bar here, which provides some additional information. So this PAR is a paragraph marker because it's an RTF file, and it's just a bunch of sample data. So this creates a file read name and makes it visible. So that's what makes it so that when I select that item, it's actually going to make it visible in the file name box, and then we would create a scanner object to read it in and populate the data. And you can see here I have a slider that's already created because the file is larger than the window that's given. So what happens when I close this? Of course, it will just terminate. And we've also got the pack feature in here, which doesn't resize the window. It just makes sure that it's compressed in a nice way. It doesn't have spaces that appear within the items. So what's nice about the JFile chooser is it allows us to navigate through the file system to select a file. So just like we've had much experience already, it selects a file by navigating to that directory, selecting the file, and pressing the open button actually brings the data in. So we would have an approve and a cancel option if we needed to, because in our case, we didn't have a cancel button, but we could certainly put one in, and the cancel button would allow us to cancel that particular data read. So here, once again, you can see the object appear. There's no cancel. But we could put a cancel in here if we, for example, had a large file to read or we had some issues. So remember, we want to make sure that we can read the file. So what we're trying to do is determine whether that file is readable, because some files could be corrupted or they could have some characters that we can't read into our window. In that case, we would provide a message through that exception. So the statements that create the file stream and read the file are enclosed in the try-catch block. So that's how we catch any errors that we would encounter by reading. One of the questions that was posed to me is, how do I know when to put something in a try-catch block and when I don't? Usually when we're getting input from the user or we're trying to do something like open files, it's a really good target for having a try-catch block because there's a lot that can go wrong. When we're performing a calculation and they're not relying on user input, so it's internal, it's less likely to be an error because we could have caught it when the user provided some input. So exception file handling for I/O, we've already talked about, and we need to have try-catch blocks to enclose these statements because the if then else structure is much harder to implement than the try-catch. It would be really nice if in future assignments, if you wanted to make it so it's more robust in reading files, having this kind of window, in fact, just essentially copying this code and knowing how it reads in file information would be very useful.